Hello and welcome to the Biological Anthropology lecture series. I'm Dr. Richard Jonathan O. Tadurin. Here we explore what it means to be human, biologically, evolutionarily, and behaviorally. Let's begin our journey into the science of humanity. Welcome to Module 6, Primate and Anthropoid Evolution. Here, we trace the origins and diversification of early primates, anthropoids, and Miocene apes. In this module, we're stepping into deep time to follow a story that began more than 60 million years ago, long before humans, long before the great apes, back when the world itself looked very different. First, let's revisit why primates emerged at all. Think about the early Cenozoic forests, warm, dense, and full of ecological opportunities. Small mammals were adapting to new niches and tiny shifts. Better depth perception, grasping hands, a diet rich in fruit started to shape the earliest primate forms. You might wonder why this matters. Well, these early adaptations became the foundation for everything that came later, including the traits we rely on every day without thinking. Primate evolution wasn't a straight line. As climates warmed and cooled, as forests expanded and contracted, different groups flourished. The rise of anthropoids in places like the Fayum Basin tells us that major branches of the primate family tree were already diversifying tens of millions of years before the first hominins appeared. As we move into the Miocene, we'll see apes spreading across Africa, Europe, and Asia, experimenting with new body plans and behaviors. Some of these lineages will look familiar, others disappeared entirely. But each one helps us understand how our own evolutionary path became possible. So let's look closely at these ancient primates and the worlds they inhabited. Their story is, in many ways, the opening chapter of ours. In this section, we explore the origins of primates and the major radiation of early euprimates. Let's revisit the bigger question behind this topic. Why did primates emerge at all? To answer that, we need to picture Earth around 65 million years ago. The dinosaurs were gone, mammals were diversifying, and vast forests were spreading across many regions. In this changing environment, certain mammals began to develop traits that nudged them toward what would eventually become the primate line. Think about moving through a three-dimensional world of branches, leaves, insects, and fruit. Survival suddenly depended on depth perception, precise hand placement, and the ability to judge distance quickly. You might wonder why these particular traits clustered together, and this is where the major hypotheses come into play. Let's look at the arboreal hypothesis first. It suggests that life in the trees shaped primate anatomy. Grasping hands and feet made climbing safer, while improved vision helped early mammals navigate a world where falling was a real risk. But as researchers gathered more evidence, they realized that simply living in trees wasn't enough to explain everything. Many arboreal mammals, like squirrels, do perfectly well without primate-like eyes or hands. So scholars started asking a different question. What if early primates were not just climbing, but hunting? This leads us to the visual predation hypothesis. It proposes that early primates were insect hunters, relying on accurate depth perception and rapid, precise movements to capture fast, evasive prey. If you picture a small mammal lunging toward an insect on a narrow branch, you can see why forward-facing eyes and grasping digits would be advantageous. Now, this part is important. This idea doesn't contradict the arboreal model. It adds another layer to it. Then there's the angiosperm radiation hypothesis, which shifts our attention to the explosion of flowering plants during the early Cenozoic. As fruits and nectar became abundant, early primates may have evolved traits that helped them exploit these resources. Fine motor control for picking fruit, color vision for recognizing ripe food, and enhanced smell and touch would all contribute to better foraging. In this view, primate traits emerge not only from climbing or hunting, but from feeding opportunities tied to a rapidly changing plant world. So why does all of this matter? Because these hypotheses remind us that primate evolution was shaped by a complex combination of ecological pressures. No single explanation captures the entire story. What they share is a recognition that early primates were responding to a dynamic environment filled with new challenges and opportunities. As you move through the rest of this section, keep in mind that the primate body, our body, did not appear suddenly. It was assembled gradually, generation after generation, as tiny advantages accumulated. The result was a lineage uniquely suited for life in forests, capable of navigating space with precision, and eventually capable of far more than those early ancestors could ever know. Let's revisit where we are in time. The Paleocene and Eocene epochs span a period when Earth was warmer, wetter, and far more forested than it is today. These conditions created an environment that allowed early primates and their possible ancestors to emerge and diversify. As we move through this part of the story, imagine not a straight evolutionary ladder, but a crowded, branching forest of experiments in anatomy and behavior. Some of these mammals looked vaguely primate-like, others only hint at what would come later, but together they form the earliest chapters of primate evolution. Let's start with the Paleocene, just after the extinction of the dinosaurs. During this time, we see the rise of the Plesiadapiforms, a diverse group of mammals that have long puzzled researchers. You might wonder why they matter if they aren't universally accepted as true primates. The reason is that they show some early features, like certain dental and cranial traits, that seem to point toward primate-like adaptations, but they lack many of the defining characteristics found in later primates. Their postcranial anatomy, for instance, does not show the specialized grasping hands and feet we associate with primates today. Think about this as a reminder that evolution doesn't draw clear boundaries, it produces mosaics. Plesiadapiforms may not fit neatly into the primate category, but they offer crucial insight into the ecological and anatomical groundwork from which primates eventually emerged. Now let's move into the Eocene, around 56 million years ago, when something dramatic happened, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. This was a sudden global warming event that amplified forest growth and expanded habitats across North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. With more forest came more ecological opportunities, and this is when we see the first true primates, the euprimates, appear in the fossil record. Now, this part is important. Euprimates show the full suite of primate characteristics, meaning they are unquestionably members of the group that leads to all later primates. The euprimates are typically represented by two major families, the Adapids and the Omomyids. Let's look at these groups a bit more closely, not by drowning in definitions, but by understanding what they were doing in their environments. Adapids tend to resemble modern lemurs in many ways. They were generally larger bodied than their Omomyid counterparts, and many appear to have been active during the day. Omomyids, on the other hand, were smaller, more nocturnal, and in several traits, particularly those related to the skull and orbits, they resemble today's tarsiers. So even at this early stage, we see primates experimenting with different ecological strategies, different diets, and different daily activity patterns. You might be wondering why these early primates spread so widely across the northern hemisphere. Part of the answer lies in the global climate. The Eocene was a time of extraordinary warmth and stability, allowing forests to stretch across continents that are now cold or arid. Primates are, by nature, animals that depend on trees, whether for food, shelter, or escape from predators. So where forests thrive, primates tend to follow. This geographical expansion is reflected in the rich fossil deposits found in places like Wyoming's Green River Formation, Germany's Messel Site, and various localities in Asia. Now let's think about why these early primates matter for understanding later evolution. First, they show us that primate traits did not appear all at once. They accumulated gradually, shaped by the demands of arboreal life. Forward-facing eyes, for example, are not simply for cuteness, they reflect selective pressures for accurate depth perception. Nails instead of claws, tactile pads, and flexible limbs were not cosmetic changes. They were functional innovations for moving through complex, three-dimensional environments. Second, euprimates demonstrate that primate diversity exploded early. Adipids and omomyids represent two major adaptive pathways, and both groups diversified significantly during the Eocene. Some lineages would later contribute traits, directly or indirectly, to anthropoids, while others would vanish entirely. Evolutionary success is not always measured by survival to the present. It is measured by the influence a group has on the evolutionary possibilities that follow. As the Eocene progressed and climates cooled near its end, many primate populations declined or shifted southward. These environmental changes acted as filters, shaping which lineages persisted into the Oligocene. And those surviving lineages are the ancestors of later anthropoids, monkeys and apes, which we will explore in the next part of this module. So as we close this segment, keep in mind that the Paleocene and Eocene were periods of experimentation, expansion, and rapid diversification. Early primates were exploring new ecological roles in flourishing forests, responding to climate shifts, and developing the traits that define the primate order today. Without these early forms, and without the environmental conditions that supported them, the later evolution of anthropoids and apes, and eventually humans, would have been impossible. Let's revisit why that burst of primate diversity in the Eocene matters so much for understanding later evolution. When we talk about early radiation, we're referring to a moment when primates didn't just appear, they proliferated, exploring different body plans, behaviors, and ecological roles. Think about this as evolution testing multiple possibilities at once. Some lineages lean toward lemur-like adaptations, others toward tarsier-like forms, and each of these experiments left clues about what worked in a forested world filled with predators, fruits, insects, and complex three-dimensional space. Without this early radiation, the later emergence of anthropoids, monkeys and apes, would not make sense. The anatomical building blocks for grasping, leaping, navigating branches, and processing varied foods were already in place among these early euprimates. You might wonder why that matters for humans. Well, the traits we often think of as human, enhanced vision, dexterity, reliance on social interaction, have deep evolutionary roots that stretch back to these early primate forms. So as we step into the next stage of this module, keep in mind that the Eocene primates were not peripheral or primitive footnotes. They were foundational. Their success, diversity, and adaptability created the ecological and anatomical framework from which later primates, and ultimately our own lineage, could evolve. First, let's revisit where our journey through early primate evolution has taken us. We began by asking why primates emerged in the first place, and we saw how shifting climates, expanding forests, and new ecological opportunities created a stage where grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and enhanced sensory abilities became powerful advantages. You might wonder why those early steps matter, but as we followed Plesiadapiforms into the rise of true euprimates, we started to see how small anatomical changes accumulated into something transformative. Now, this part is important. The Paleocene and Eocene weren't just early chapters in primate evolution. They were periods of remarkable experimentation. Adipids and omomyids weren't simply primitive prototypes. They were thriving animals responding to a dynamic world. Their success tells us that primate traits made sense in the lush forests of the early Cenozoic, long before anthropoids or apes evolved. Think about that for a moment. The traits we rely on every day, from depth perception to fine motor control, have their origins in this ancient radiation. As we close this section, let's look forward. The diversity established during the Eocene paved the way for later primate groups, especially the anthropoids we'll explore next. Without these early innovations, without the ecological experiments of euprimates, the story of monkeys, apes, and eventually humans would look entirely different. So carry these foundations with you because they set the evolutionary framework for everything that follows in this module. Thank you for joining this lecture. I'm Dr. Richard Jonathan O. Tadurin. I hope this session deepened your understanding of biological anthropology. Keep exploring what it means to be human. See you soon.